Hi, welcome to the Prairie Oaks Pulpit Bible Study, and we're continuing our journey here through the book of Chronicles, Second Chronicles to be precise. But we're going to look at what happens next, because last week we saw where there were two women, and they had picked very different paths for their lives. One chose the path that she would be queen. She was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, her name Athaliah. And she was married to the king of Judah before he came to the throne. His name was Jehoram, and he was not a good king. In fact, he may have been a better king if in the eyes of some, because he did exactly what the kings of Israel would do. Ahab, Jezebel, Athaliah, they were his advisors, basically, because Athaliah was married to him and gave him instructions of what he should do, which was not what was pleasing to the Lord, just as Ahab and Jezebel had done. And his sins brought him to untimely death, and his son then, her son, would then become king, Ahaziah. Well, he didn't reign for very long because he too followed after the pattern set by Ahab and Jezebel through his mom, Athaliah. And when God brought judgment on that house, he died with them, being so close to them. In fact, being in the way when the Lord's anointed means of judgment wiped out that family, except for one survivor, Athaliah. And Athaliah, seeing that there wasn't anyone to rule from the line of David, she saw it as a good opportunity to perpetuate her family line by becoming queen in Jerusalem. And to make sure there wasn't anybody to get in her way, she, to the best of her ability, wiped out the rest of the line of David, which is where we then hear of the second woman. This is a woman who chose faithfulness to the Lord God. Her name was Jehoshebeath or Jehoshebeath. Either way, her name means God has promised, the covenant of God. And she snatches up the infant son of Ahaziah, her nephew, and smuggles him and his nurse into the temple. And he lives incognito, in secret, for the next 6 years while his grandmother, Athaliah, reigns in Jerusalem. And she does everything she can to eradicate the worship of the true God and to promote Baal, the false god that her mother and father promoted, and that she had promoted while her husband and son was alive. And now that they're gone, she's doing even more so. And so that's where we get up to in 2 Chronicles 22. Because we see where the Lord allowed people to choose poorly, but he would remain faithful to his promises. And then the third lesson we got was that God works even when we don't see that he is. Because we saw where everyone would think from what they saw, the Lord had forsaken Jerusalem and the line of David. There was none left. But God was at work, remaining faithful to his promise, and had spared one son to continue the line of David as king. And that's where we pick up in chapter 23. In the 7th year, Jehoiada, who was the high priest, who was married to Jehoshebeath, he strengthened himself and made a covenant with the captains of hundreds. And we're given the names of those captains of hundreds. These are military officers. And verse 2 says, "And they went throughout Judah and gathered the Levites from all the cities of Judah and the chief fathers of Israel, and they came to Jerusalem. Then all the assembly made a covenant with the king in the house of God. And he said to them, Behold, the king's son shall reign, as the Lord has said of the sons of David. This is what you shall do. 1/3 of you entering on the Sabbath of the priests and the Levites shall be keeping watch over the doors. 1/3 shall be at the king's house, and 1/3 at the gate of the foundation. All the people shall be in the courts of the house of the Lord. But let no one come into the house of the Lord except the priest and those of the Levites who serve. They may go in, for they are holy, but all the people shall keep the watch of the Lord. And the Levites shall surround the king on all sides, every man with his weapons in his hand, and whoever comes into the house, let him be put to death. You are to be with the king when he comes in and when he goes out. So Jehoiada the high priest is arranging to put the true king back on the throne. You could call it a coup, except that it's not a usurper taking the throne. The usurper is already on the throne, Athaliah, and Jehoiada is trying to get, as God had promised, as the Lord had said to the sons of David. Even notice he says that in that little speech. Jehoiada says, it's supposed to be a son of David. And we have the Lord's word on that. Remember what we said? The Lord's going to be faithful to his promises, both for blessing as well as judgment, discipline. And the Lord works even when we don't see it. And so Jehoiada makes this plan to protect the king, the last survivor, as well as to reveal him on a busy day in the temple when all of God's people would be there to worship, and crown him as king once he's got people to help him. The priests, the Levites, guards, he's got them all together. And so I'm going to skip down to verse 11. I guess I'll start at verse 10. Then he said, all the people, every man with his weapon in his hand, from the right side of the temple to the left side of the temple, along by the altar and by the temple, all around the king. And they brought out the king's son, put the crown on him, gave him the testimony, and made him king. Then Jehoiada and his sons anointed him and said, Long live the king. Can you get the picture? And so all these guards and ceremonial, but ready to fight. And they have filled the temple, and there's an audience there, and they bring out this little 7-year-old boy, this descendant of David, and they put the crown on his head. They give him the law of God. They give him a copy of Deuteronomy. And they anoint his head with oil, symbolizing the Spirit empowerment upon him. And then they shout, and the people shout, Long live the king. Just as Solomon had been crowned, and his sons and his grandsons, and through, here is this one here, Joash being crowned. Now, there's still a little problem. There is a queen who is sitting on the throne who believes it is her kingdom. And that's got to be dealt with. And so, verse 12. Now when Athaliah heard the noise of the people running and praising the king, she came to the people in the temple of the Lord. When she looked, there was the king standing by his pillar at the entrance, and the leaders and the trumpeters were by the king. And all the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets, also the singers with musical instruments, and those who led in praise. So Athaliah tore her clothes and said, Treason! Treason! Now, she's right, but she's wrong. She's right, there was treason. She was wrong in that it was her that was treasonous against God's stated law. It wasn't them. It was her. And so tears her robes, cries out treason. She wants someone to rally to her side. But verse 14 says, And Jehoiada the priest brought out the captains of hundreds who were set over the army, and said to them, Take her outside under guard, and slay with the sword whoever follows her. For the priest had said, Do not kill her in the house of the Lord. Keep the Lord's house sacred, but take her outside, and anyone who rallies to her, take care of them too. So they seized her, and she went by way of the entrance of the horse gate into the king's house, and they killed her there. Then Jehoiada made a covenant between himself, the people, and the king, that they should be the Lord's people. And so it's a covenant ceremony. He's involved in it as both the representative of the Lord, but also, well, this little 7-year-old, he's not ready to reign by himself. He's going to be looking to others for direction. And Jehoiada and Jehoshebeath, who raised him, they're going to covenant with God as well to raise him up in the way he should go. And then all the people, and there's an expression there in this, the people of the land. You heard it earlier. So while we're not sure who all was on Athaliah's side, the people of the countryside, it sounds like, were not on her side. They wanted to see a descendant of David where he belonged on the throne. And so the covenant is between all of them that they should be the Lord Jehovah's people. They would belong to him again. Baal had been the chief god for too long, and now they would be the Lord's people. And verse 17 says, And all the people went to the temple of Baal and tore it down. They broke in pieces its altars and images, and killed Matan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. And so, first and foremost, they had to get rid of their old idols. When we rededicate ourselves from, as Baptists, we have a term called backsliding, where we have turned from the Lord. We've lost our way in following him because we've gone after other things. Well, those other things have to go away. They have to be given over to God, to destruction. And so they had been following Baal. Baal was the antithesis of the Lord Yahweh. And so they tore down his temple. And as the law specified, anyone who led others to astray from the true God, they were to be put to death. This was the way the theocracy worked. We're not in a theocracy today, but this is how the theocracy of the Old Covenant worked. And so they broke down the altars, they broke down the images, and they wiped it all out, which is what happened in the north just a few years before at the hands of Jehu, the son of Nimshi. So if you want to know more about that, go back to 2 Kings 8 through 10, and it's in that area. And so tear down what was wrong, but we got to put something in its place and restore the true worship of the true God. And so that's what's next. Verse 18. Also Jehoiada appointed the oversight of the house of the Lord to the hand of the priests, the Levites, whom David had assigned in the house of the Lord to offer the burnt offerings of the Lord, as it is written in the law of Moses, with rejoicing and with singing, as it was established by David. And he set the gatekeepers at the gates of the house of the Lord, so that no one who was in any way unclean should enter. And so restore the old worship of the Lord, just as had been required by the law and by David, who had assigned how worship in the new temple would take place once his son got it built. And there was to be rejoicing, there was to be singing, because revival was aflame again. And so the rest of the chapter talks about how they brought Joash to the throne and put him in the palace, and the people of the land are rejoicing. The city is quieted and has peace because the wicked Athaliah has been slain with the sword, and the new king, the proper king, has been restored. And so there's some balance once again. Justice has been served. The one who had slain the Lord's prophets has now been slain herself, and the worship of the true God has been restored. And Jehoiada, the high priest, and his family have helped restore that. And chapter 24 goes into some of the details of that revival. It says that Joash was 7 years old when he became king. He reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zibiah of Beersheba. Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest. And Jehoiada took 2 wives for him, and he had sons and daughters. Now it happened after this that Joash set his heart on repairing the house of the Lord. Then he gathered the priests and Levites and said to them, "Go out to the cities of Judah, gather from all Israel money to repair the house of your God from year to year, and see that you do it quickly." And it doesn't happen fast enough for him, partially because I think it's going to take a while for revival to get through to people's pocketbooks. You know how that is sometimes, right? And even the priests and Levites seem to be a little reluctant here, maybe because they're needing to get caught up. I'm not sure what's going on in this. But Athaliah is described by Joash as having broken into the house of God. She took things from the house of the true God and took it to the temple of the Baals. There's a lot of work that needs to be repaired here. And so it says in chapter 24, verse 8, "Then at the king's command, they made a chest and set it outside the gate of the house of the Lord. And they made a proclamation throughout Judah and Jerusalem to bring to the Lord the collection that Moses, the servant of God, had imposed on Israel in the wilderness. Then all the leaders and all the people rejoiced, brought their contributions, and put them into the chest until all had given. So it was at that time when the chest was brought to the king's official by the hand of the Levites, and when they saw that there was much money, then the king's scribe and the high priest officers came and emptied the chest, took it, and returned it to its place. Thus they did day by day, and gathered money in abundance." So do you see what's going on? They set a chest by the door of the temple, and they're like, "Bring here your contributions, and it will go towards the house being restored, to the temple being restored." And so Jehoiada and the king send out the proclamation, and the people are like, "That's what we're looking for. We don't want it to get sidetracked anywhere. We want to see the Lord's house repaired." And so they give money. And I encourage you to read through these verses that I'm kind of giving you the sense of, because in these we see where God's people were faithful to give. And God's servants, the Levites and the priests in Jerusalem, they were faithful. And they paid workers and bought materials and repaired the Lord's house. And when they had gotten everything repaired and back to the way it should have been, to the glory of God, then they said, "Well, we still got some left over." So then they bought furnishings and tools and implements for the worship, so that everything was ready to worship the Lord as was intended. And I'm almost reluctant to continue the story beyond this point, because we see the flames of revival going. Jehoiada has raised up Joash, and Joash is doing a great job, and Jehoiada is honored in an amazing way here. Verse 15 says, "But Jehoiada grew old and was full of days, and he died. And he was 130 years old when he died. And they buried him in the city of David among the kings, because he had done good in Israel, both toward God and toward his house." They buried him as one of the kings, even though he was a high priest. because they so honored what he had done for God and for the temple and for the country. Alas, it was the beginning of the end for Joash. He was a better follower than he was a leader. And instead of continuing to lead in revival, he became a follower of those who did not honor God. And he forgot what Jehoiada had done for him, and instead followed after those who flattered him and led him astray from the true God. And so he dies, and he doesn't even get buried with the kings. Jehoiada did, as the priest who restored the Davidic kingdom, but the one he got on the throne didn't deserve it, because he had departed from what the Lord had given him. And that's a grim reminder for us to remember what the Lord has done for us and to live for him wholeheartedly and not sputter out, not to depart, and not to become bitter, but instead to continue to honor the Lord. This is where we're going to leave off in the story. We're going to not continue to follow these kings, but you can go ahead and continue to read through 2 Chronicles and to see what all takes place. I think I've mentioned before, we've been going through the life of Hezekiah on Wednesdays there for a while through the eyes of the prophet Isaiah. So you can pick up on some of that as well. But next week, we'll be looking at someone completely different as we look to see how God brings revival. But let us finish strong the race that God has set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despised the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. God bless.